All right, great. So welcome to everybody. I have a feeling that we will be welcoming more people as we get going because there was a technical difficulty with the wrong link or not a link or something being on the page. So more people will probably join us, but I wanted to say hello from the Northampton Chamber of Commerce. As we got started with this new way of being, where folks are working from home and being, working remotely. For us, it was a pretty quick change, although many of our team worked occasionally from home. Everybody working remotely was a pretty quick turnaround. So we're one of many that had to adapt and adjust quickly. So we thought it would be meaningful to bring together some folks who are experts in this, that guide their clients through this sort of process frequently, can answer a lot of questions and provide resources, not only for working remotely efficiently, what are the tips and tricks and tools that you can access, but also how to consider how to do things safely, and what are the resources that you need to keep in mind when it comes to security when everyone is not in the same place. So I will just I also want to mention that we will be recording this session and we'll make it available to folks after the fact. So we're going to go through with each of our panelists, and I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves to the group and then offer us a few tips and tricks. Each of our panelists comes from a slightly different perspective with a slightly different focus, and then we'll be able to open it up to any questions that the group may have. So why don't we get started with Dave? And you are
okay.
not
well, thanks for hosting.
Yeah.
I am not muted.
You are not muted.
So thanks very much for the invitation to take part. And so I'm Dave DelVecchio. Let me start with the basics. President of Suite 3. We're an IT services company based in East Hampton. And our client base ranges from solopreneurs up to kind of upper mid-market companies of several hundred employees. And the common thread between those clients is that they need to keep data secure. And so regardless of company size, everybody, it seems like March 12th was the day that the world shifted. That was the Thursday that kind of preceded the first discussions about stay-at-home orders and people needing to mobilize and work remotely. It's been interesting to work with all of our clients on how they've had to make those adaptations given the new world order. So glad to share whatever insights I can offer.
Great. Tom, do you want to go ahead and just introduce yourself?
Sure.
Great.
So I'm Tom Poulin. I work for Crocker Communications. We're a local internet provider and voice over IP company, as well as an answering service based out of Greenfield, Mass. I've been working with Crocker since 1995. I can't count the years. Math is horrible. But we focus a lot in the healthcare space. We focus a lot in the K through 12 space, as well as a lot of small businesses in the area and nonprofits. Jess worked with me for many years on the answering service, as well as the telecommunications side. She knows voice over IP a lot better than she will claim to do.
And Chris.
It was nice meeting you all today.
Chris, you can go ahead.
Hey everyone, I'm Chris Allard from Northampton Computer Repair and also Ink and Toner Solutions. We work with a lot of home users, end users, small offices and home offices. We've got more or less 1 to 5 employee businesses that we support, and just anybody with computer issues. So had a lot of experience just over the last couple of months with getting people set up to work from home in a completely different environment, and try to help them with security as well, which is honestly just been pushed to the back of everyone's mind, functionality being first, but also important to think of everything else. So yeah, we've been fortunate to stay open and help everyone. But
Great. Great. All right. Well, let's take this opportunity to hear from Dave. We'll start with you again, go back around. And if you wanted to share with us your, points to consider or tips and tricks, that would be a great place to start.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned in the intro, really the influx of calls just exploded on Thursday, March 12th. And so that's kind of the day that we saw the shift towards remote access needing to be everybody's primary concern in terms of mobilizing technology for their business. And the theme of those calls were usually either we've got 2 people who are working remotely now, how fast can we add an additional 15? Or it was, we've never allowed remote work to happen before. How can we have everybody work remotely securely? And we had at first it was like, well, wait a minute, slow your roll a little bit, because ultimately, usually when you're putting remote access solutions in place, to Chris's point, doing so securely is a huge factor. And these are the sort of things you don't normally rush through, but we were forced to rush through a lot of these expansions or implementations over those last 3 weeks of March into the beginning of April, but really had a focus on making sure people were accessing things remotely securely. So what we really identified were 3 challenges that all had to be kind of addressed. The first was getting users mobilized. And whether it was setting up VPN or virtual private network connections from home computers into their office computers, if their environment had an existing remote access solution in place, like what's known as RDP, remote desktop, or Citrix environments, it was expanding those with more users. But getting those folks mobilized was the first priority. The second thing, which we've been helping a lot of clients with, is expanding their office communications platforms. In business environments, many people have moved to Microsoft Office 365 for email mostly, but there are tools like Microsoft Teams, which we can talk more about if people are interested, that really help facilitate employee-to-employee internal communications. Sets up those virtual water coolers sometimes to allow people to still interact and collaborate. And then that third challenge is working remotely securely, because quite often what you've got now is, if your business environment is set up securely, but if all your users are accessing from their homes, which may not be set up in the most secure manner, what potential risks are you opening up to your business? And so those are the 3 challenges that we've really almost exclusively been focused on since March 12th.
Great. All right. Tom, you're up next.
Sure. Well, just like Dave, we've been working from home since March 11th, and right after that, our clients were immediately trying to figure out how to get their telecommunications to work from home. Fortunately, they were set up with voice over IP, so that made the transition fairly seamlessly. I thought it'd be maybe best I could explain how my setup is at home, which is typical of what a typical voice over IP user would do. So for example, at home, I have 3 different ways that I can communicate making and receiving phone calls with my clients. I have a typical phone sitting on my desk. It's a voice over IP phone. It's a handset, and it gives me all the same functionality that I would have had within my office. I can transfer calls. I can set up 3-way conferences. I can see my coworkers, whether they're on the phone or not. I can speed dial those coworkers very seamlessly and easy. The phone is very easy to set up at home. Mine runs over Wi-Fi, so it connects right over my home Wi-Fi connection. I didn't have to run any wires to get my home network set up properly for it. It was just put in the password, now it's good to go. I also have another means of connectivity with a phone, and that runs on my iPhone. And with my iPhone, I'm fully mobile. So if I want to take a walk around the block, or I need to help the kids out with some of their schoolwork, and a client calls me, I'll get the call right away on my phone, and I'll know on my iPhone that it is a call coming in from a client. The same thing holds true when I call them back. If I call them back from my phone, they see the call coming from my office number. So they don't ever see my iPhone number, my cell phone number. They don't ever see my homeland number. They only see my office number. And a third way, which is very typical of voice over IP, is I have a software that runs on my actual desktop. And that allows me to do additional things like collaborate with my coworkers. We can share screens, share files, have video calls like we're doing here with Zoom. So with voice over IP, there's a lot of tools out there that allow you to work and with your coworkers and allow you to communicate with your clients as if you're in the office, even though you're not. The technology is great because it's all in the cloud. Everything's in the cloud, and when things are in the cloud, it makes transitions seamless. So, and if your places of business, if you've walked into your electrical room, you've probably seen a box on the wall. If you're not using a voice over IP system, that box is the old school way of doing it. That box is not mobile. That box is what your phone in your office was connected to. So you'd have challenges of going home and bringing that technology home with you. Having that box in the cloud is what makes that a seamless transition. You know, the calls go over the internet. That's why they call it voice over IP. The calls are not going over your copper phone lines like you would if you had your landline at home. There are a few challenges that we had to run into with our clients. You know, with an actual handset, when you bring it home, you have to make sure that 911 is updated so that if someone dials 911 from that phone, they're not showing up in your office. And you have to do that with handsets. You know, you think about it, one of my kids walked into this room and they dialed 911 from this phone, and I didn't update that record. You know, the public safety is going to be showing up at 101 Munson Street, Greenfield. So, you know, they're, you know, having a bunch of clients on the 12th of March, bringing their phones home, we had to deal with 911 and a lot of changes there. But otherwise, I would say it's been, you know, a good transition for us. We're also using a bunch of other tools. You know, Dave talked about Teams. We can talk about that some more. Teams has been great, Microsoft Teams. I just finished working on a proposal that I did with my coworkers, 100% collaborated with Microsoft Teams, you know, video calls, file sharing, working on the documents together. You know, it's kind of crazy because it's like almost, this is easier than it was working in the office. So definitely had its challenges, but it's been good.
Well, it's funny. I mean, to that point, Tom, two things actually. One is I just read an article this morning where the daily number of users of Microsoft Teams has nearly doubled in 1 month. It went from like 30 million, 31 million to, no, I'm sorry, 35 million to about 70 million. It's almost doubled. They're approaching those numbers. So I think businesses that hadn't gone down that road are now exploring it. Out of necessity. Those that had already started using it, I think, were able to really accept its use and expand its use because they were already somewhat familiar. But it's definitely been a challenge. The other piece with the phone systems, we've seen it with our clients. We do have some clients who have been on voice over IP phone systems for some times, and the transition to working remotely was nearly seamless. Those folks that had the traditional PBX style in the closet, as Tom was describing, phone systems proved challenging because if they couldn't get physical access to their building, they couldn't set up a lot of the find me, follow me features the way you can on a hosted VoIP solution. In general, a lot of these sorts of technologies, when people have been considering technologies for their business, one of the filters that they should put it through is would the use of this technology help in a business continuity scenario? A lot of the impact of this whole pandemic has been that business continuity plans, if they were written, have been called into effect. And for those people that never wrote a business continuity plan, you know, how do we survive some sort of an incident where we don't have physical access to our business or there's other disruptions that occur? How could we pick technologies that will allow us to continue to function? And things like voice over over IP phone systems have proven invaluable towards that end.
Right. Yeah. As an example, Crocker, we're an answering service, so we're a call center. Our call center is 100% remote at this point. We always have remote operators working, 2 or 3 at a time for backup. So we were kind of already, luckily, in a position where we were already working the technology and using it. But it's seamless. All of the program back end of how your call center works. The length of the queues, the messages that are delivered, the waiting comfort messages, all of those things are in the cloud. Nothing needed to be set up on the fly. It's more or less bringing your software home, your phone home, and connecting it over the internet, and you're operating just as if you were in the office and participating as such as a member of a call center. So it's a great technology. A simple example of that, simpler would be more like, if you think about when you call an office, a lot of times you hear, "Thank you for calling such and such, press 1 for this, press 2 for that." That's the main greeting for your business. That greeting in a box environment, when it's in your closet, is a greeting that's sitting on that box. So in the cloud environment, it's not there, it's up in the internet. So if you lose all connectivity to that building, continuity-wise, you lose access to your actual business telecommunications, where in the cloud you do not. So, from a continuity standpoint, this is a pandemic disaster, so we're all needing to work remote, but voice over IP does bring a lot of things to the table. And for other disasters, you think back to the snowstorm of 2010, I believe, where, we had a lot of problems with power within the buildings. Having voice over IP back then was also very beneficial.
I think you're muted, Jess.
Now I'm not. I'm going to turn this over to Chris, but I have one of the things that I've been thinking about that we'll circle back around to is, for lots of people, they were in the position to move forward, to work remotely, and now they're like, oh yeah, it would have been great if we had voice over IP, or it would have been great if we had, these secure systems in place. I think it would be great if we could backtrack at some point to talk about, all right, so if you're in that situation, how complicated is it at this moment to implement some of these tools? But let's go to Chris first, and then we'll circle back around to Dave and Tom. All right, Chris, you unmuted yourself. You must have done this before.
I got it.
You must be very technically proficient.
Oh, yeah. I think, we work with a lot of folks who didn't have the voice over IP or, any real infrastructure in place, and are now trying to piece together ways of collaborating, which, to that end, I do want to actually share a post that we wrote recently on our website about just essential ways you can get started for very low cost with some already established tools. Interestingly, Tom and Dave talked about Microsoft Teams, and that was one thing that I tested quite a lot recently, and it is just absolutely seamless. It has essentially everything you'd need for a team from 2 to 3 people all the way up to, a massive company. Works great with Office, has video chat integrated and conferencing, live events for broadcasting. So, honestly, it's one of the most promising utilities I think you could look at. It does have a free version that you could try out. So anybody wanting to collaborate with somebody else in their office, just try that, because honestly, it's pretty great. But I'm going to leave a link in the chat to our article. Hopefully that works. It just has some great ways of starting out. If you don't have a system in place that could have allowed you to transition, if you don't have voice over IP, it has some just general utilities like Hangouts, where you can do a forwarding from your landline to a Google Voice number, that kind of thing. It's not perfect, and it's certainly not going to continue. It's not going to work like a voice over IP that Tom would offer, where it looks like you're calling from your own office, and you can't really spoof that, but at least it'll let you get calls. There's a whole lot of security concerns around everything, but essentially we tried to focus on the recommendations we made. There are all two-factor authentication possible, and that should be the way you start thinking about everything that you want to try using. The way you got to think about it in the middle and at the end. It's critical along every process, because every time you use something cloud-based, you're exposing an account for one of your employees or teammates to essentially expose that online account to an attacker through just a well-crafted phishing email even. But there's plenty of things out there that are really low cost that you can get started on and try out. So yeah, I think that's about all I had to offer for now, but I'm looking forward to the questions.
Well, Chris, actually, I want to piggyback on your point, because you started talking about, two-factor or multi-factor authentication. If folks hear those terms, they mean the same thing. Well, I prefer multi-factor just because someday you might want to use 3. But the idea behind it is you're combining, usually it's the combination of something like a password, with something you have. So when you're logging into a website, for example, to make administrative changes on a cloud solution, or even if you're just logging into your banking website, you put in your password, and then you can set it up so it quite often will send you a text to a cell phone with a code that you then have to type in, so that if someone tried to log in because they knew your password but they didn't have your phone, they would be blocked from doing so. That's multi-factor authentication. And it goes to a broader point of the incidence of phishing emails and malware threats and ransomware that have been put out that are coronavirus COVID-19 related has exploded. And so when you have the combination of more threats on the threat landscape with reduced security because people started working remotely in a rushed fashion, you're setting up a potential perfect storm for security. And so that's where I do cybersecurity awareness training quite often, and I like to use the phrase, the best defense is a healthy dose of skepticism. It's the user's responsibility to really know how to work in their computing environment securely. And I like to draw the analogy that just because you have seatbelts and airbags in a car, you still have to know how to drive. You got to keep it between the lines. You don't drive into a tree and expect the airbag to save you. You shouldn't necessarily do unsafe computing habits like not using MFA when it's available and expect your antivirus software to solve all your problems. So you still have to kind of follow some of those basics. And I know in addition to setting up multi-factor, using complex passwords and changing default passwords on any sort of devices or setups is critical. If you're still using any passwords like 1 2 3 4 5 or any dictionary word, it's a really good idea to start looking at best practice for password hygiene. Using a different password for every website. Always have it be different than any business account that you have. If you're logging into a business's network, you should never use that password anywhere else. And making sure that you're following those sorts of best practices so you're working securely.
And to touch on that point also, it's great to know whether or not some of your passwords may actually already have been exposed, which in the start of that article I bring up, that's the first step you should make. There's a service that Firefox offers called Monitor, which uses a well-known database of data breaches. It allows you to check if any of your emails have been involved in that, and you can sign up for ongoing monitoring of those emails if they're involved in future data breaches. If they were, passwords you used for those services absolutely need to be changed right away because they were exposed and should never be used for anything else. Of course, they should never be used for anything else anyway, but at least this password may have been, I should not use that for anything. It's a great service. It's free, and it's through the Firefox or Mozilla Foundation. So their privacy is pretty decent.
Well, just making sure you can hear me. Okay, great. I think it would be appropriate right now just to open it up to some questions. Since we don't have pages and pages, I think if you've got a question, you can either chat it to me, wave your hand, or just unmute yourself and we'll be able to figure it out. We don't have a zillion people here, so we should be able to get through the questions. And then perhaps we can touch base on that circle back around. Like, so, okay, so what would be my step one? But I kind of want to get a feeling from our attendees about where they are in this process. So does anybody have a question for our panelists?
I don't have a question, but I do have a question. One is about passwords, as we were talking, but I do want to say that this session would have been so great to have, as we were all trying to figure it out a little earlier, but we are where we are. And let me say to each of the panelists, thank you so much for sharing your insights here today. And I think we can all evolve. I know the Chamber, we're a small organization, and as just said, a number of us were working remotely and, you know, we're being productive, but as a team, we now all work remotely, and we actually was among that 35 million folks who now use Teams.
Wow.
So we contributed to that growth. Zoom obviously has taken off for a lot of organizations, but I want to go back to the conversation that Chris started around passwords. And I never thought, I often use my personal password is the same that I use at the office. So I'd like to kind of get your thoughts on what makes a good password, and maybe you can explain why it's not good to use the same password, because the thinking is that it's secure, but why it's not good. And the other part of my question is, can you repeat, Chris, those services where you can detect whether or not your password has been breached in any way?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a service called Firefox Monitor, which I think it's just monitor.firefox.com. And if the links in the chat work, you should be able to actually get to it directly from our post. But I think Dave linked to a post they wrote specifically to actually explain how passwords work. I'll read that too. Essentially, I think, you know, the complexity matters, but the idea of it being longer is also helpful. I know that adds entropy to the overall password itself. So the longer, the better. It doesn't need to be so complex you can't remember it, but there needs to be a certain amount of complexity. The length certainly helps with that. So as just a general rule of thumb, the longer, the better. But say you could come up with some kind of picture in your mind. I think back to a comic that I saw once about a person thinking of a horse with a stapler in front of him, and that stapler had a breathe there. So he was thinking of a picture of a horse with a stapler and a bat. It was the correct horse battery staple, and you can add things onto that to make it more complex. But essentially, you're just thinking of 4 words, piecing them together, and you've got a really long, high entropy password.
Yeah, that's
it doesn't
actually
have to be. Yeah.
That's a great idea, Chris. That's actually a very common best practice currently. You know, thinking of it in this term, your password kind of works just like the combination on a combination lock. The more pins that you have in that combination lock. If you've got 5 or 6 tumblers versus only 3, it's going to take you that many more combinations in order to try and guess that password. So the longer a password is, if a hacker were trying to brute force attack your account, if they had an unlimited amount of attempts at running a tool to guess the password, which of course a computer can throw millions and millions of combinations at that attempt, if there isn't something set up to say after 5 attempts automatically block the account, and they had an unlimited amount, eventually a tool can guess a password. The longer you make that password, the longer it would take in order for the guess to occur. I did post 2 posts in the chat. Unfortunately, when you post to the chat, it looks like for both Chris and me, it doesn't make them hyperlinks, so you have to copy and paste the link into your browser to read the articles. But one of the posts I posted is how secure is my password? I used a website that estimates, based upon the average computing power, running a password cracking tool, how long it would take to guess a password, and you can put a password in and test it. I don't know who's behind the site that I use to do this, so I always caution people, don't put a real password of yours in there to test it. What I did was I came up with a little example where I had a cat and a cat named Fluffy, so I'm going to use that as the basis for a password and put a handful of different types of passwords in there to show the difference in how long that tool would take to crack it. That's what the post reviews. So it'll give you an idea of some good ideas. To answer your other question, Chris, about why not to reuse passwords if you think you got a really good one, the problem is there are many instances where websites have lost that data. And then that data then gets sold on the dark web, which I'll define what that means. But basically, I'll give you an example. Back in 2013, Yahoo had a breach where they lost 3 billion sets of credentials, meaning usernames and passwords. The worst part of it was they didn't go public with that until like 2016. So I was caught up in that breach because I had an active Yahoo account, and I guarantee you back in 2013, that since this wasn't top of mind for everybody, I was using the same password on Yahoo that I was using on Facebook and Twitter and God knows where else. What ended up happening last January was TurboTax, the online tax preparation company. They're owned by Intuit, same company who runs QuickBooks, if anybody runs that for their business. All of a sudden, it was determined that there were fraudulent tax returns that were being processed. And at first, everybody was like, oh my God, TurboTax has been hacked. And so they started looking at it forensically and realized every fraudulent return which was submitted, because what the crooks were doing were putting in a fake return for a taxpayer that generated a refund. The refund got sent to the fraudulent account. Then they would close the account and pocket the money. And it wasn't found to have occurred until the real taxpayer tried to submit their taxes, and it was bouncing back as, hey, there's already been a return filed. And that's how they started chasing the stuff down. Well, what TurboTax determined was every one of the tax returns that was filed using legitimate login credentials. And so they started trying to put 2 and 2 together and realized that there was a correlation that the people that had tax returns filed were actually part of the Yahoo breach in 2013. So the likelihood, what somebody did was said, well, if people had a Yahoo account, maybe they use the same password on TurboTax. If I can log in with the same username and password and I get in, I'll file a fraudulent return. And so the fact that the same username and password was used on multiple sites became a big risk point. So ideally, you always want to use a different password for every website. So God forbid, if any one gets breached, that you don't give away that combination for everything that you might have a password set up for. Now, I will already answer the next question. And Chris, I'd love to get your opinion on this. The next question always is, well, geez, that means I have 100 passwords. How am I supposed to remember 100 different passwords? And so we would strongly recommend using some sort of quality password management system. I know one that we often refer by name is Lastpass, which is spelled like it sounds, Lastpass. You can get both business level subscriptions where you can actually buy licensing for every person in your company to be able to manage all of their passwords. And you can even set up separate containers for your business passwords versus ones you use personally. If you get a personal account, you can even set up a family account where, so example, I have a log in from my banking accounts. My wife doesn't actually have access to those, but if something were to happen to me, she could get emergency access to my passwords. So it's something you might want to look into is a quality third-party password management system. But just like everything else, there's other options on the market. Chris, do you have a favorite password manager that you recommend to your clients?
Yeah, actually, that's in our article, the area, one of the top 5 utilities is password managers, cloud-based ones.
Yep.
And Lastpass is top of the list. We also really, Dashlane for user functionality, for the simplicity of it. We see a lot of people using that, and it's great. And there's also an open source one called Bitwarden that looks incredibly promising.
We're actually
It
looking
has
at that
tons of
ourselves.
features.
Yeah, the big
Yeah.
thing, actually, one of the big ones is it supports multi-factor authentication. And actually the
does.
one that we leverage at our business. So the best part is this way, you want access to your passwords, you need to have both a password and the second factor. So you're doubly protecting that password vault. So yeah, we've actually been evaluating that one ourselves. Yep.
Yeah, but yeah, absolutely. A password manager too. We've set probably 2 or 3 of our clients up with a centralized password management. It's cloud-based, and they're able to share passwords across their organization. If their manager set up their bank account password, they don't necessarily even have to expose that. They just have to share the password with their employee, and it will autofill as soon as they visit the bank account. Certainly, they'll be a little more granular security controls you can have on that, but man, the one thing everybody hates worse than a rock in their shoe that they can't get out is dealing with passwords. This will really help.
Does anyone have a question they'd like to pose to our panelists or to each other? Do any of our panelists have any questions for each other?
Well, actually, I can bring up a couple more topics because I think that there's the other areas where people can focus their attention while working remotely. One of the line of last defense, if there's ever any sort of an incident, whether it's an accidental deletion, whether you fall victim to ransomware or something, is you need to rely on your backups. And in a business environment, if you're working in an office, typically there's some sort of a centralized, managed, overseen backup solution. And one of the fears is with people working remotely, perhaps they're not being good about saving all of their files and all of those normal business repositories. If they're working on a personal device, maybe it's going onto that device, or that data could be ending up in other places. So be vigilant about where you're saving your data. And the most important thing to keep in mind with any sort of data backup is you get what you inspect, not what you expect. Meaning, even if you've been good and have a backup solution in place, the last thing you want to do is have the first time you have to do a recovery be when you really need it to work. So test the backup periodically. I gave a presentation where I included that advice a few weeks ago. It was over a month ago because it was actually in person. But after the session, an attendee came up to me and thanked me because in addition to the work she did for her employer, she did all of the books for her husband's contractor business and had realized she'd been backing up the QuickBooks file to a thumb drive for 6 years and had never once tried to recover the file. And she was going to go home that night and run a sample recovery to make sure the backup worked. And I was like, I wanted to give her a hug. I'm like, if that was the big takeaway, it's like, because it's one of those things, I've seen this story play out before where someone has a corruption in a file, goes to do the recovery, and the backup file is corrupted too or doesn't work for some reason. You don't want to discover that in an emergency. So for anybody who's working remotely or even if you're working in normal business where maybe you've always worked remote and this isn't anything new for you, make sure that whatever you're using to back up your files is working and is tested, because that's nothing's worse than losing data.
I'll back up
it's a bigger
that
shoe.
is a regular thing.
I was going to say it's a bigger pebble in your shoe.
Yeah. I actually think it might be worth mentioning too, just as far as testing your team's responses to security incidents like phishing attempts. If everyone's working from home and you can And you have this ability for them to be slightly more out of their element as far as thinking about security and being able to detect phishing attacks. There's quite a few utilities, and not to sound salesy, but we actually offer one of these services to do to do phishing testing. So it's a security training. Basically, you're sending out batteries of actual phishing emails, trying to see which of your employees might be able to click on them. I think working from home, this is kind of a prime time to get something like that going, just a security testing battery, security awareness training, really. Because so many people are seeing emails from their personal accounts and their work accounts, and it's kind of getting hazy, like trying to separate the two. But it's never a bad time to do something like that to make sure your organization can just handle a phishing attack, a strong phishing attack. But with the increase in the amount of them lately, it's really a perfect time to look at something like that. And there's paid options like the ones we offer, but there's also just free things that you can set up as well to test your own organization if you're smaller and just can't afford something massive.
Yeah, and to back it up with data, I know that this is 2018 data released in 2019. The 2019 data hasn't been released yet from the report that I'm quoting, but in 2018, 34% of all data loss incidents were caused by phishing emails. It was by far the leading cause. So there are certain types of emails that come through that a spam filter will do a pretty good job of picking up. But a lot of these emails come through with no real technical reasons why it should be blocked as spam. It's really relying on what's known as social engineering to get a user to do something without necessarily thinking through the consequences. And sometimes those will get through to your inbox. So testing for what you're really testing with the sort of system that Chris is describing is, does the email recipient have that healthy dose of skepticism to be able to be that last filter, that last line of defense? And in general, when you're inspecting an email, look at every component. If the from sender is not someone you normally work with, or if it looks like it's coming from Dave DelVecchio, but instead of DelVecchio at suite3.com, it was received from 79468 at commail.org. That's not probably a legitimate email because they're spoofing my identity with a bogus address. What's insidious now is quite often people will send what's known as spear phishing emails, which are very pointed, intentional targets. And if someone wanted to impersonate me, let's say someone wanted to try and get my financial administrator Sean to route $40,000 to a fraudulent account, they'll actually go so far as registering a domain. Maybe they'll do suit3 instead of suite3 and leave the E off of it. So they'll send an email from DelVecchio at suite3.com. He'll receive it, and if he doesn't have that hypervigilance to notice that there's one character off, he might reply to that email. And they're getting that sophisticated. So looking at the from line is one of the first key things you can do. Definitely never click an attachment if you're not expecting an attachment from the sender. If the to line has 50 people's names in it and you don't know the other 49, it's probably a mass blast email that might not be legit. And if you're receiving emails, I had an example that I often give. Sometimes you'll get an email that looks 100% legit, and they're hoping that the timing is perfect. I had just set up a new Apple product for myself, and within an hour received a phishing email that looked like an email from Apple. It had the logo, it had the return line, everything about the email looked like an email from Apple, and the content said, hey, your Apple ID was used on a new device. Click here to verify its authenticity, or something along those lines. And I had to sit there and look at it for 5 minutes because I'm like, I don't remember ever getting an email like this before when I've set up a new device, but it looks awful legit. Until I realized that sender line was not actually from Apple. The return address actually was from a different account, and I deleted it, and everything's been fine since. So they've gotten that sophisticated where it can be just one little factor that will clue you in as to that it's a bogus email. And when in doubt, delete. If you get an email you're questioning might be legit, let's say you get an email, you're expecting a package from FedEx, and you get a FedEx tracking email. Rather than clicking on the link, go to the FedEx site and type in your tracking number and check it yourself. Don't rely on those quick links either, because sometimes those quick links, if you're not expecting an email, could take you to some place you don't want to go.
All right. We have about 10 minutes left, so I wanted to give everyone an opportunity to ask a question if they had one. And then I was, if there aren't questions for our panelists, I was hoping that for folks who switched quickly to working from home, if they had to implement 3 things to enhance either their efficiency or their security, what would your recommendations be? So step 1, does anybody have any questions before we jump into that?
I have another question, and I want to be sensitive to questions that our other participants will have today. But Tom, I'd like to hear from you a couple of things. One is, you mentioned, and I hope I heard you right, is that people had to bring their phones from the office home to get them set up at their homes. And just clarify that and explain why was that so important, when my understanding is that when you have this voice over internet, you can just do everything remotely. And secondly, if an organization is looking to upgrade and contemporize their phone system, what are the first maybe 3 to 5 things they need to consider to be able to engage with your organization and do so?
Great. Yeah, let me clarify that. So they didn't have to bring their phones home, but it was an option if they wanted to. So, you know, they can use the technology with software running an app on their smartphone, or they can use the technology running a software on their computer. You just need a USB headset or using the speaker and audio through the computer. It's nice to have your phone because it's comfortable and it's something you're used to using. And it's programmed the way you've always seen it within the office. So it's definitely portable and makes the transition nice, but not required by any means. As far as like transitioning goes to voice over IP, it's pretty fluid. The most difficult part is moving the phone number from the carrier that you have to your new voice over IP company. You know, just like you would number port with your cell phone, the same thing happens in the business community. And, you know, depending on the carrier that you have now, that in terms of timing is the one that always takes the longest in my world. I don't want to name any carriers, Verizon, but sometimes those carriers take longer to work with than others. Some carriers, we can move numbers over in 24 to 48 hours. Other days it can take, other carriers can take, you know, 10 business days. But as far as getting you set up on the back end, it's more or less a consultation. We find out how your business works. We program the system on the back end to match those needs. And then we would port your numbers and get you operational. You would need to have a device on your end in order for that to work. And in today's day and age, the easiest way to get you up and running on a device is the software. Otherwise, we would have to order a actual handset and get that handset working in your office. The handsets have come a long way. They're Wi-Fi capable now, so they don't require a network cable, but they do require from your home a power source, and that's a simple power supply. And I say the word simple with quotes because we talked about this a couple weeks ago. Power supplies are very hard to get because everybody rushed home with their phones, so they're on back order everywhere. So if you don't have a phone or a means to use one at this time and you're looking to move to voice over IP, I would first recommend going the software route because it's quicker and easier to do. And Dave,
unfortunately, these are getting hard to get now too. The headsets are all getting constrained. So if you don't have like mine is both Bluetooth and USB. I plug in hardwired just for events like this for you know, so God forbid the battery dies midway through or something. But the I know we had to order a replacement because one broke for one of our technicians, and it's on back order now. So these are starting to get constrained as well.
It's true. We had to get some new ones for our call center operators. We ran into some challenges there. I mean, everything that's remote, even laptops, right?
Yeah.
Not easy.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Webcams, it's 5 times the cost that they usually are at this point.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, great.
All right. So let's go backwards this time. Let's start with Chris. And what if you were giving recommendations to someone who had no plans to work from home and is now working from home every day of the week, what are the top 3 things that you would want them to consider to be efficient and or secure?
You know, I think there's like a higher psychological concern of working from home that will just damage a workflow based on you're just not in an office environment. So I think something that allows you to communicate with your team on an ongoing basis is essential, and that could be a video conferencing app or a messaging app, a team messaging app, something like Slack or Microsoft Teams. These 2 kinds of things are essentially the same functionality as a text message, where you're going to get a ding, you're going to pay attention to it, and you're going to continue your workflow. Plus, it keeps you in communication with your team. Having a good, you know, conference once a day, if that's not feasible, more often or less often. But just, it's hard to stay in touch with your team. And when you're working from home, your focus is not always going to be on work. So it's just having something, a utility like that, that has messaging and the ability to make a video conference happen, I think will be just essential, keeping your mindset focused.
Great.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm going to agree with that 100%. You know, we used to do audio conference calls every morning from a manager standpoint. Switching over to Microsoft Teams, especially with everybody being remote, just the psychological aspect of not seeing everybody every day. Using that tool every morning, having those video calls, it's been great for us. It's really, really been wonderful. Yeah.
Awesome. Dave, what do you think?
I'll give you a couple. I'm going to approach it 2 days. There's the technical answers, and then there's the kind of the, you know, personal answers. The technical stuff we kind of touched on. I can't reiterate the importance of passwords. Passwords and backup. If there's 2 things you remember out of this, technically, those are the 2 things I'd probably reinforce the strongest. And keeping the healthy dose of skepticism. You asked for 3. So basically, back up your data and test the backup. Get real about passwords and maintain your healthy dose of skepticism to scan for bad emails. From a working from home kind of experiential standpoint, the 2 things that I find most critical for myself is having a place where I work that is dedicated. Now, what's funny is my wife is the exact opposite. She'll work at the dining room table for a couple hours, move to the island in the kitchen, sit in the couch in the living room. She just keeps bouncing around and she can stay focused. I can't focus like that. I need to, when I go, in fact, I've referred to going to my basement office as going to work. So it's like, oh, I'm going to work, hon. Oh, see you later after work. You know, I go down to the basement. It's like I'm going into work when I make that transition. The other thing, which might border on TMI, is my selection of pants. It's if I'm wearing the same pants I would wear to the office, I feel like I'm working. If I'm wearing, you know, pants I would wear when lounging at home, I'm not working. So it's literally the psychology of getting dressed for work, I find has been critical for my sanity.
I've literally found out that I need to put shoes on, or I'm not going to be
same
focused.
thing. I got shoes on right now. I'm sitting in our bonus room. Yeah, it's amazing how the psychology of preparing to work is so critical to the experience.
I'm wearing sneakers. I'll come clean.
As long as I have a presentable top, I'm good. You have
right.
No idea what my flannel pajamas look like.
And I'm sure on most Zoom meetings, you're not the only one. Right? Pay no attention to what's behind the curtain.
This has been just great, and I'm so appreciative to all of you for your willingness to share your expertise and your insight with the community. Thank you very much. These are, I'm always just struck by the generosity of our small business community. So thank you very much for being here, and thank you to everyone for being a part of this conversation.
Very good. Thanks, Jess.
Thank
Everyone.
you,
All
everyone.
right.
Thanks, Jess.
Be well, everybody. Take care. Take good
You
care.
too.
Thanks,
All
you
right.
too.
Same to
Bye-bye.
all.
All right.
See you guys.
See ya.